We come now to the last and perhaps most infamous and widespread Protestant objection to Catholic epistemology, drawn directly from Scripture. This passage about the Bereans is so gravely misunderstood and frequently abused by Protestants because it has a superficial plausibility and persuasiveness. But some careful attention to detail and context reveals it doesn't prove what Protestants think it proves. So let's start by reading the context that Protestants either ignore or gloss over in this passage. They, meaning Paul and his companions, came to Thessalonica. The Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked fellows of the rabble, they gathered a crowd, set the city in an uproar, and attacked, dragged Jason and some of the brethren, the Christian brethren, before the city authorities. And then the brethren sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. These Jews in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them, therefore, believed. So, let's summarize this passage quickly. The Jews in Thessalonica reacted violently to Paul's preaching and arguing. The Berean Jews did not react violently to Paul's words. They consulted Scripture, and some of them believed. All right, with that summary and all that context in mind, let's now analyze it and show why it doesn't prove sola scriptura or a Protestant epistemology. First, the Bereans were Jews at this time, not Christians yet, and not subject yet to Christian authorities like the apostles. So this passage is not an example of how Christians settle an internal doctrinal dispute, or even an interpretive dispute over Scripture. You can't find a single example of Christians settling a doctrinal dispute by Scripture alone. If you want a biblical New Testament example of how Christians settle internal disputes, look at the Acts 15 Council of Jerusalem, which involved authoritative church leaders, especially Peter, silencing the debate in favor of one position over another, for the sake of unity and peace in the church. No scripture directly and clearly settled the matter for the church at the Council of Jerusalem. Next, it should be noted that Paul is evangelizing Jews using a common authority, namely Old Testament Scripture. Again, he's not talking to fellow Christians who he could teach and command by his own apostolic authority alone. When a Christian limits himself to the common authority of the Old Testament when evangelizing Jews, he is clearly not affirming that only the Old Testament is authoritative, because clearly the Christian believes the New Testament writings are also authoritative. Likewise, the Christians thought Paul himself was authoritative, not just what he wrote. Likewise, Catholic Christians do not believe Scripture alone is authoritative either. though Catholics may at times condescend to limit themselves to the common authority of Scripture in order to evangelize Protestants. Happens all the time. Hopefully you can see the connection I'm making here. Moving on. Sometimes you will hear Protestants say, Paul commends the Bereans for checking Scripture, or sticking to Scripture, or only believing Paul after verifying his words, or preaching from Scripture first. So first off, Paul doesn't commend anyone for anything in this passage. The narrator, or author, Luke, merely calls the Berean Jews more noble than the Thessalonian Jews. Nothing more, nothing less. And why exactly does Luke call them more noble? Is it because they checked Scripture, or stuck to Scripture, or only believed Paul after verifying his words, or preaching from Scripture? No, not at all. Luke calls these Jews more noble only by contrast to the Thessalonian Jews. The Berean Jews didn't try to kill Paul and his companions by inciting a riot and the civil authorities against them, like the Thessalonian Jews did. Are we really to believe that the Thessalonian Jews didn't have or know Scripture? No, surely some of the Thessalonian Jews did have and know Scripture, and still rejected Paul and his preaching. Now, lastly, we should point out, only some of the Bereans who examined Scripture actually came to believe in Jesus and accept Paul's preaching. So, are the Bereans who examined the Scriptures but did not believe, are they also noble? If you read the passage very carefully, you can see that both in Thessalonica and in Berea, there were Jews who listened and believed, and Jews who did not believe. But the Jews in Berea who did not believe did not try to kill Paul and his companions, showing even the unbelieving Berean Jews to be more noble than the Thessalonian Jews. So, it's extremely questionable whether the nobility of the Berean Jews has anything to do with the searching of the Scriptures specifically. Lastly, one interesting likelihood is that the Berean Jews, being in Greece, were reading from and examining Greek Old Testament texts, the Septuagint, almost certainly, which likely included deuterocanonical texts like Wisdom, Sirach, Judith, Tobit, and so on. Quite plausibly, Paul was citing chapter 2 of the book of Wisdom and chapter 3 of the book of Baruch to the Berean Jews to support his preaching about Jesus and the gospel, just like we see in the early church, specifically in the Epistle of Barnabas, Athenagoras, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus, Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, Cyril of Jerusalem, and Athanasius, who all appeal to one or both of those deuterocanonical books in support of the gospel and the identity and divinity of Jesus. I did a whole video on the early church quoting deuterocanonical books, And not just quoting them, but quoting them as inspired scripture or to confirm doctrine, like Christological dogmas. So please, I'd encourage you to check out this video.